time to talk music, audio gear, and anything else that crosses our minds. I'm Mark.
And I'm Peter.
And welcome to the Hurton Audio Podcast. So, I think today we're going to have a discussion on just game soundtracks in general and how they influence people. Because obviously all music is music no matter what medium it's on, be it film soundtrack, game soundtrack, CD audio. It's all just music, isn't it, at the end of the day when you strip the media out of it?
Well, the thing I think is we talk about sometimes is repetitiveness. Like certain songs, particularly songs on radio, are drilled into you because they're on the A playlist or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And they have to play them like 6 times a day or whatever, or 6 times an hour, whatever the radio station does. And what's more drilling than playing a game, say a game like Tekken, and you are stuck on a certain fight or certain stage, or you just love the menu music, you play it every day, you always boot up and have to sit through the menu cutscene. And you know, Tekken Tag Tournament 2 has one of the best opening sequences for music, I think, that you can even listen to.
Tekken Tag Tournament piano intro, massive version, basically. And it is
the title matches.
It's just the most hyped thing you can listen to. I feel like, you know, there's a lot of hyped game intros and just soundtracks in general, but this really does take the cake for just excess and hype. You know, it just, you're ready to go, aren't you, when you listen to the massive intro?
Yeah. It gets you going. And the other thing is, as well, is that if you play these games at like a young age, I think like a lot of people do, that sort of makes a permanent imprint in your brain. And a lot of the genres used in video games are wildly different to that of commercial music, because a lot of the time, you know, it's hard to get, I mean, I think this is something that's changed recently, but it's hard to get major label acts to do sync deals on games, particularly in the past when gaming wasn't as culturally relevant as it is now. So a lot of the soundtracks in particularly like early games, like I'm talking anything like PS2 and before, and, you know, the Xbox and Nintendo equivalents, are sort of really off the wall, not often electronic.
And before the PlayStation 1, they couldn't actually put CD audio in a game. That was the first console where they could actually put CD audio in a game, which is why games like Wipeout 3 were like the first games to have a actual, like, not game soundtrack, you know, like actual music artists.
Yeah, because previously,
sync deal.
If you're unaware, they would have to use the console's inbuilt sound card, and the score would be provided in MIDI, something that any music producer should be familiar with. And basically, it's sort of just play that sound card via MIDI per level, so there would be no audio. And that's how like the Game Boys and stuff worked for a really long time after the technology got better.
Yeah, and you're basically, if you as a composer for those, you're limited by the technology. And basically now, obviously, you just drop an audio file and you can do whatever you want for the soundtrack. You just drop it into the game files, and it's a lot easier.
Even on the handheld consoles, like I think when the new Pokemon's soundtrack was like audio and not like that sound card MIDI situation like it was in so many of the Game Boy games, it was like, whoa. That's very different compared to what, you know, you got used to. Yeah,
because you expect a certain thing with a lot of these games, and obviously the breakout of it. Now, the interesting thing is we're starting to see an immersion of different genres influenced by retro gaming, because there's Nintendo Core, that's a massive thing. I wasn't a Nintendo child. We didn't really have.
We had on and off Nintendo, but not
on and off, but not enough to really get into like the old school ones. Like
you
a
also
GameCube.
have, on a familiar tangent, Outrun, which is obviously based off the Outrun game primarily.
Yeah. And then I've seen an emergence of what they're calling low poly music, which is like drum and bass, jungle, ambient drum and bass, all that sort of side of it, influenced by Wipeout, Ridge Racer, Ape Escape, and a bunch of PlayStation 1 games. So there's like 3 different genres in 3 different categories, just off the top of my head, that we've seen sort of cropping up. Now, I know Nintendo Core and stuff has been bubbling up for a while, but are we going to see like a big push where games actually are like the driving influence that people are inspired by. And like you say, when it comes to chasing nostalgia, people grew up with these sounds.
And they were on repeat. That's the other thing.
And they was
like,
on repeat.
Like very, very bent into people's brains, certain soundtracks. You know, some people can hear say on a more recent example, Persona 5 soundtrack, people hear like two notes and they know exactly what it is.
Yeah, it almost places you straight back in to the game. And obviously you hear a lot of streamers use it just to soundtrack their streams, and you just hear it all the time. And it's very iconic as well, with the sort of smooth, not quite jazz, but just smooth organ-based sort of like, it's almost like between jazz
lo-fi.
and soul. Yeah,
I would say
lo-fi,
basically.
But yeah, it's very interesting to see how game soundtracks can capture people's imagination. I mean, another really notable one is the Halo soundtrack.
Yes, the
with
Halo
the
intro,
choir, and then you have the guitar version, obviously. But a lot of people will go back to that as like the single piece of music that they remember from, say, their childhood gaming experiences.
But it's also games like GTA where they've had a lot of songs synced. People just sit there. They might listen to one of them stations on GTA 4 or 5 or Vice City or whatever it is, and just have them songs like just ingrained into them. And then they go, well, I want to listen to this music more. And that might be the foundation for certain people's taste, essentially.
Yeah. The V-Rock soundtrack or the, like you said, since GTA 5's been out such a long time.
I wouldn't be surprised if that had completely shaped people's music tastes.
Music tastes. Obviously, you have games like rhythm action games do a lot, because obviously you're having to listen to the song. You tend to pick your favourites. So obviously Rock Band and Guitar Hero was a big driver to get young people into rock music, particularly classic rock music.
Yeah, I don't know what the correlation is between people who like classic rock and people who played Rock Band, but I feel like Rock Band and Guitar Hero both had a massive, massive impact on that being cool and relevant. Because I suppose a lot of people will have been like at the time, well, you know, if you can't play this song, then you know, whatever, you're not good at Guitar Hero. And, you know, when you're in like gaming circles, that starts to become well, I know that song, and everybody just wants to fit in and know it and be like, oh, yeah. And so I think that's why so many people know classic rock. That's, you know, like, I mean, to multiply like how much older the music they're listening to is than themselves, it can get bizarre, because some people might be listening to music that's, you know, 4 times older than them. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And obviously you have bands like, say, Dragon Force on Through the Fire and Flames really using that as a pivotal career point to get them out there.
Yeah.
I mean, it's if Guitar Hero 3 wasn't a thing, it makes you wonder if Dragon Force would have took off.
Yeah.
Now,
it's a good question.
I don't know whether they was already taking off and then they got that and it sort of like boomed, but you know, it's one of those things that is basically what a lot of people remember Dragon Force for, is Guitar Hero 3's Through the Fire and the Flames, isn't it?
I mean, I would argue that bands like Led Zeppelin, who did not, you know, use that opportunity, you take them sync deal offers, I think they did a lot of damage to their sort of perception of younger generation, because obviously if you grew up with Led Zeppelin, you're never going to forget who they are, but there'll have been plenty of impressionable kids playing guitar and Rock Band that were never exposed to Led Zeppelin through them games. And I think really all you can do is miss out when it comes to stuff like that, because the amount of like artists that have just, people know exactly who they are. People know, you know, it's not even like, oh, have you heard of them? So, well, of course we've heard of them. There was on Guitar 3. I mean, every song on Guitar 3, I think people know exactly, if they've played it, what, you know, who these bands are for the most part.
Yeah, because you had to read the artist name, the song, you like, on some of the games, you know, you read the tempo or the whatever, you know, with it, but you have all the stats basically there ready to go. You read the year it come out,
album cover,
the album
a lot of
cover.
them.
Yeah, so you know it, you know as well as a single in your vinyl collection, basically.
Yeah. And there's still, it's amazing that Rock Band, I know Guitar Hero has not sustained itself, but Rock Band's still going.
Yeah.
Which I think is insane, but like fantastic. I mean, if I would love to see a Rock Band 5, but whether they can do it, it depends. But I mean, all the backwards compatibility is there, but
Yeah, I suppose the thing is that it's just about accessibility, and when people are scalping the controllers for like 250 quid on eBay, it does make it harder to get into.
But that shows the demands there. If people are willing to pay 200 quid for like a Fender Mustang controller for Rock Band, then clearly the audience is there.
And this also gets into, like, I've noticed a correlation when doing, say, research on low poly drum and bass. The games that have those soundtracks are worth more than the games that don't on eBay. The games that have that slight bit of influence, whether it's popularity or whatever, obviously people want these games still. And that's why you'll see, like, some of the games going for 50, 60 quid, the same amount as like a brand new PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5 game. And that's just because obviously people are after them, and then people on eBay bid them up. And it's like any collector's items, you know, if they're in good condition, people will try and get their money for them. And you think, well, you know, I remember when PS1 games was all in a £1 bargain bucket bin, and it didn't even matter which game it was. It was just any game. Do you know what I mean? I think that was when like the PS2 and the original Xbox was out. You just saw the PS1 bin in a shop.
I think if you're doing retro gaming, the best time to buy would be as the next console comes out.
Yeah.
And when that next console's settled, that's when you clean up and buy all the games. Because if you wait any longer, they become rare, they become damaged, and all of a sudden, like you say, you cannot buy them.
Yeah. So it's very interesting to see, like, obviously, you have a lot of like cultural movements in the 90s. You have like the acid, drum and bass. You have house and techno, all sort of vying for like that millennium,
garage.
And garage
in the late early 2000s,
sort of millennium breaking thing that you assume with, like, say, the Matrix's trailers and you know, like all this, like, essentially the umbrella of Y2K, basically.
Yeah,
like all those genres that are sort of fighting for this is going to be popular in the next millennium, like towards the late 90s. So I'm talking like 95 to 2000. And this is the sort of soundtracks that you hear a lot, obviously, because it was not only beginning to be popular music, but I think a lot of it is counterculture music as well.
Yes, ultimately,
it's not the pop songs. It's the absolutely drilling, like TB 303 acid tracks that you hear on like Tekken, you know, or Wipeout. It's the drum and bass tracks that permeate all the racing games just because of how fast the BPM is. It's more exciting than having a slow... I mean, you can't play a racing game with ballads on.
Even if you think about games like Need for Speed Underground 2, like Skindred, I feel like everybody knows that Skindred track.
Yeah. It's like you say, some of the songs just...
stick out because they just end up on the menus and you're just exposed to them.
Yeah.
And as you say, some of them are very counterculture tracks, and they're just so off the wall and aggressive. But like you said, they have to be, because on Wipeout, you've got to go fast. So it wouldn't make sense, like you say, if there was country music playing. That maybe makes sense if you're in the mountains on GTA, but it does not make sense on a futuristic speed racer.
And that's the other thing with the futuristic speed racers in general, is that it has to push the envelope and it has to feel like the future. And the thing is what there wasn't really using cutting edge technology for the most part with, say, TB303s and 808s and stuff. But obviously, those instruments came out during the 80s, and then people figured out how to use them in the 90s for a completely different thing, because obviously acid and all that they're not using them how they was designed to be used as, like, you know, bandmates and buddies, you know, to practice with in your garage.
I think it was more they go to the like bargain bin section in the local music shop and say, well, I can afford that. What can I do with it? Like, can I do anything with it? And people figured out, didn't they, how to make them sound exciting.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that really shapes the sound of them genres. I mean, we sometimes say about the technology, like what comes first? Is it the ideas or is it the technology? And I feel like sometimes there's a perfect storm of there's this instrument that nobody could adapt, and somebody figures out how to do this unique thing with it, and that might be the catalyst for what creates a music genre, what defines a genre.
Yeah, a bit like how the sound of Native Instruments Massive just was the sound of like
dubstep and everything.
Dubstep and EDM in the late 2000s, early 2010s.
And then literally it becomes like the preset library is just every song.
Because obviously
people are just figuring out, oh my God, well, these sounds are bizarre.
Yeah.
So let's just use the sounds and be, cool.
So like an example of this is obviously you have, say in the 90s, you have drum and bass, techno, garage, and house all bubbling up. Emu look at this and their Rompler sort of series of rack mounts and say, well, we can cater to a niche audience who want these sounds but don't necessarily have the equipment to make these sounds. So, boom, you have, say, the Orbit, which is just for like Eurodance, trance, and all things like basically 90s dance music is that rack mount. Then people get the Orbit and then they make 90s dance music with it because that's what the sound set allows you to do. It's basically a sample pack in a rack mount that is tailor-made for anything or every sound you need to make that music.
Well, I suppose, like say, back in the day, there was really no such thing as sample packs. Like you either got a memory card that somebody had pre-sampled and pre-loaded for you, or you literally bought a 19-inch rack mount synth that essentially is like a modern sample pack is now, but that would have been the equivalent.
Yeah. And it's only when they started doing like genre specific ones, which not a lot of companies did, to be honest, but obviously every, like say, if you look at Roland, every brand new iteration will have cutting edge sounds in, which then also feeds into this.
Yeah.
It's all about using the latest technology if you have access to it. And then obviously if you have a piece of gear before any other composer, well, you can sound, like futuristic.
Yeah.
Because you have the brand new sort of sounds.
Yeah.
And that was a lot more prevalent when they literally could create a different type of sound entirely. I mean, I know they're getting into like physical modeling a lot more now and different synths, but a lot of synths that come out now feel more like tribute sounds than brand new engines.
Ultimately, it's technology like the binaural engine that the Udo Super 6 has and stuff like that is more the defining characteristics. I mean, technology-wise, like you say, apart from physical modeling, which again physical modeling doesn't sound futuristic, it sounds realistic. So whereas back in the day, FM and subtractive synthesizers, when they started pushing them, they sounded very alien because they're not really familiar. Off this world.
Yeah, and also they're not familiar and you've not heard anything like it. Because if you've been listening to like Junos and stuff, then the Yamaha's like, here's a DX7. Everybody goes, I've never heard anything that sounds like glassy or digital in that manner, because everybody's been listening to warm analog synths for decades, even if it's only 2 decades.
Yeah.
But that's the thing. And obviously this is where you get into like we say, you have music that inspires technology, and then technology inspires the next lot of music.
Yeah.
And it's almost like leapfrogging, essentially.
Yeah.
And that's sort of what you see happening with a lot of these genres. Obviously now it's great because if you want to make like 90s dance music, you can just buy a 90s box.
Yeah, or a 90s sample pack.
Or 90s sample pack.
Or 90s like inspired plugin, which there is a plethora of all of these things. So you can just choose the one that fits. I mean, I do think a piece of hardware, if you're doing low poly stuff, a piece of hardware is probably going to feel more inspiring because that goes with the aesthetic. But if you're doing dubstep, you're not going to, even if there's a great hardware machine, you're probably going to prefer to just use like Serum or something because that's where the genre comes from. So I think it's all about authenticity. And, there's opposite examples like the Midnight making unbelievably fantastic synthwave all in the box. And then there'll be people like Aphex Twin making unbelievably experimental electronic, mostly in hardware. And so it's like it can go either way. It doesn't necessarily define the sound, but I think it can be a catalyst for getting people into certain sounds and for inspiring you. I know some people find a computer very restrictive, but some people also find the computers the workflow. So when they have to leave Ableton or whatever DAW they're using and look at a box with a sequencer they don't understand, that's the thing that stops them. So
It's all about preference, really. Preference and workflow and what you prefer. Do you prefer to be drawing it in on a mouse and sort of having a computer there so you can work quickly? Or, I mean, I suppose this is where people have a go-to piece of hardware where they can do something very technically complicated very quickly on a piece of hardware that they wouldn't be able to do on the computer, you know?
It's all about knowing your equipment and being comfortable with your equipment, because unless you want to just sit there and experiment and be like capturing stuff and figuring something out, if you're say on the clock, you got to punch in, right, I've got 3 hours in the studio, I've got to make a beat, then this is not the right conversation. This is like you're going to experiment and you know, you have to figure some stuff out sometimes. You know, sometimes it can be productive just to learn how to use a piece of equipment that somebody might have either bought you or you've bought yourself, and you thought, oh, well, it's sat in a drawer and I'm never going to use it. It's like, well, maybe just pick one afternoon and try and figure out how to use it, even if it's how to use it your way, because you'll get a lot more out of it.
Yeah,
literally.
And also, I feel like in the modern age of DAW recording, anything you can have that people don't have is almost like a leg up in a way.
Yeah.
Because I think if you're, I mean, there's always this argument of never using like the entire stock library for any DAW, because in theory, anybody who has that DAW has that library. But obviously, it's all about what you do with it. Like you can do whatever you want with it, and you know, if you're creative, you can make something that nobody else has ever made. But obviously, there's the other argument is if you have things that other people don't have, nobody can make what you can make with those things, isn't it?
And even if you're using something like Vital, which is a free wavetable synthesizer, I mean that software is so powerful. If you was organized, you could make nearly anything with it, because you can start sampling oscillators and building virtual recreations. I mean, you could just download a pack that has a bunch of Juno oscillators in, load it into Vital, and then build a library of Juno sounds, and vice versa. I mean, I think there's actually some Juno sounds in the stock wavetable library on Vital, but as you say, it's how can you get your production somewhere where somebody else might struggle to get that far? Because like you say, nobody wants to sound like somebody can literally just make the thing you made in like half an hour if they know how to do it. Because there's something like soul crushing about that, about slaving away at a production and then somebody being like, yeah, that's like the second patch on Massive.
Yeah, because you know, like if you ever got really successful with a song like that, you'd have like Ableton YouTubers going, well, I'll show you how to make his track in 15 minutes because it's all made on Ableton.
Well, that's what people do with Daft Punk now, isn't it? They're like, well, Daft Punk sampled these 5 songs, so boom, 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 look, it's face to face. But you're like, yeah, but Daft Punk didn't have Ableton when they made it. You know, it's...
Yeah, they had to do it all in different technology, different means.
That at itself, in that time, was revolutionary, that they could even sequence it in a way that made sense. So, and that's the other thing with technology now, as it gets better, what you can do is crazier and crazier, but it also means these like legendary artists, you can mimic them in like 10 seconds if you know what you're doing.
Yeah, it's like the tape loop, like as a concept, you know. You can just like put your locators on Control D, tape loop.
Easy.
You don't need like a room full of Brian Eno tapes on microphone stands threading round the room for half an hour. You can just be like Control Alt.
Yeah.
D, you know, or
whatever. Yeah, Control D or whatever. Whatever it is. We all know what it is. Control D. So to spin this conversation back around again, we're seeing like low poly music rising up in artists like Pizza Hotline.
Yeah. Major axes I particularly like as well. I definitely think Pizza Hotline is like the guy who is creating like he's the one doing the mixes on YouTube. He's the one sort of making this into a thing, basically.
So it's about can there be some momentum? Is there going to be a group of artists come up with him and define a scene?
Yeah,
because that's the problem with scenes, is that somebody can have a great idea of a music scene, but if people don't come with them, essentially, it's hard, because you feel like, well, I don't want to rip Pizza Hotline off, but it's like, yeah, but in order for that to become a scene, then people have to sort of go, even if they don't have to rip him off, but they have to sort of join in. Otherwise it's just one artist doing something.
Put your own spin on it, I suppose, is one of those things. But I mean, obviously, with Super Shy by New Jeans, you're hearing that exact sound set
in
like a very popular song that is like in the global top 10, if you mute the vocals on New Jeans, it is just low poly ambient drum and bass, really. That's all it is. Like, obviously, low poly is a buzzword. That's like, it's basically your descriptor in the way it is. It's just ambient drum and bass, technically, is what it is. And then, obviously, low poly is as much of a like thing that you can lean into as it is a visual style, a bit like with synthwave.
It's just something to characterize something in a way that's interesting and that invites artists to join in. I feel like ultimately that's why you create or why people manufacture these words, because they're sort of incentivizing people to join in to create a scene. You know, otherwise you'd just be like, well, I'm this guy or I'm this person and I just do my own thing, and that's what experimental artists do. But when people are saying this is a genre, this is a thing, you are inviting, people to join in.
The other thing that, say, like New Jeans shows you is it shows you that this Y2K sort of undercurrent that people have been sort of like leaning into, saying, yeah, well, this is coming back. They're like, oh, well, it's back.
It is back. Yeah. There's a difference between it's coming and it's in the charts.
From like the Pixel Powerpuff Girl ripoffs on the album cover to the full sound, all the sound design, they're sort of hitting like,
it's the entire package, isn't it?
It's the design. Hitting multiple genres that we talked about being in like the 90s earlier on. And then sort of they're bringing it modern and then they're stripping it back so it sounds old at the same time.
But interestingly, when we talk, like you said, the New Jeans album, it's not just drum and bass. It's got a bit of garage influence, a bit of house influence, and a lot. Is there going to be an opportunity for all of the different electronic subgenres of the early 2000s and late 90s to somehow be rolled into one genre? Like we've seen... Obviously, people keep saying genre isn't as much of a thing.
And we've seen like Dimension sort of putting trance and
drum and bass
together.
So is there like an opportunity where there could be a genre that actually encompasses several subgenres of electronic and it's acceptable to make, as you say, maybe low poly, and low poly could be drum and bass or house or whatever, but it encompasses the same... or a set of rules that create it to be low poly, but it's not flexible. It's not unflexible, like say something like drum and bass, where there's an expectation when you make drum and bass of it's got to be this sort of tempo. It's got to have like a 2-step beat and some breaks a lot of the time.
I think this is all about classification. This is about, is a bunch of journalists going to call anything a name anytime soon, or are we just going to suffer to not having like bubbles of popular trends that people can jump on?
Yeah,
that's basically it.
Or is it going to be a couple of one-off cases that don't actually accumulate to anything, or are people going to say, like we saw with things like Slap House or Tropical House or the sort of new scene in drum and bass, like Jump Up and stuff, are people going to latch on to low poly style music and say, well, I grew up playing Wipeout, I want to get in on this? Are we going to see bigger acts a bit like New Jeans, sort of
reharnessing that like Y2K 90s sort of dance sort of vibes, which is already coming back via house, and you're hearing orchestral stabs. It's there in the undercurrents if you're listening out for, if you know what to listen to. All those sound sets are slowly coming back in. Obviously TB 303s and 808s never went out of fashion, so
that's true.
It's there to be had. But you let us know in the comments whether we're talking a load of rubbish or not. But I think it's been quite an interesting discussion. What do you think, Peter?
I think that the idea of, like, obviously synthwave is a precursor to this. It's just taking, and this is not a new thing at all. There is a cycle. We all know that there's a cycle to music where it repeats.
Yeah.
Like in the 2000s, people were rehashing 60s and 70s music. That's just a fact. When you actually look back, it becomes very obvious, whereas at the time it might not have been as obvious if you were younger and you didn't realise. You have to be an encyclopedia to know where people are pulling all of these ideas from.
Yeah.
So I think that it's practically guaranteed that we will see like these old game soundtracks infiltrate pop music, but it's the weight of how much it matters. That I suppose the question is, with New Jeans, does that music just serve as a sound bed, or is it part of that group's identity? That's the question, really.
Yeah.
And that's up to them and how their career actually progresses. And I suppose that's really, it's dependent on if artists make that a cornerstone of their sound, or if artists say, this is the flavour of the month, this is this era, and then we're going to move on to the next thing.
Yeah.
So that's our thoughts on game music and low poly music, and the question of how new acts and bigger acts will adapt it. So let us know what you think in the comments below, and thanks for listening. I've been Peter.
And I've been Mark. See you next week.